I would have moved here about the same time that Jeannie did, except that I graduated from university in June of 1968, which was just about the height of the ground war in Vietnam. And I was suddenly given the opportunity to attend University of Southern California summer school, where I could begin getting a teacher's certificate. So I went to school during the summer, and I started in the classroom in September 1968 in the heart of the LA ghetto, just south of the LA Coliseum, for those of you who know it, about a mile or two north of the heart of Watts. And in 1965, when the Watts riots were on, the National Guard bivouacked in the yard of the school at which I taught. This was where the Black Panthers rose up and confronted the US organization and all. It was quite an educational experience for me at the time. I appreciated it more in retrospect than I did when I was living it. Anyway, that's background to why I didn't get here as early as you did.
You didn't all the way down the line. I'm older than you.
I could have been here at the same time. Okay, I think that Gary and Ingo's presentations this morning admirably covered the subjects that I was afraid we were going to be tasked with or failed to address. So I don't have anything more to say about the publication of Das Kapital or the Russian Revolution, nothing to add there. Just picking up there though, the ensuing 70+ years after the Russian Revolution were marked by conflict between communist movements and other Marxist-inspired forces against capitalist governments and their allies across the world. While many criticized Marxist methodology as well as the politics that it inspired, capitalism continued to be racked by the increasingly disruptive crises and dramatic upheavals that were participated in by a wide range of people who were deeply dissatisfied with their lives under capitalism. This was particularly true in the 1960s, when black ghettos were rocked by major rebellions. Groups like the Black Panthers responded to institutionalized racism and the police brutality that accompanied it. Rank-and-file workers took part in shop floor confrontations with management and contributed to the disintegration of shop floor discipline. Surging labor militancy gave workers the power to extract significant wage increases from their employers. An increasingly militant anti-war movement, along with rank-and-file rebellion in the ranks of the U.S. military, created increasing difficulties for governments determined to continue waging the war in Vietnam. While there was widespread participation in these disparate reactions against different aspects of capitalism, militarism, and racism, these upheavals did not congeal into an organized or coherent political response capable of addressing popular discontent, let alone transforming the system. But at the same time, the capitalist establishment, which was very concerned about all this popular upheaval, began to organize strategically to push back and assert itself. In 1971, Lewis Powell, a man who would later become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, wrote an extensive memorandum entitled Attack on American Free Enterprise System, which amounted to a blueprint to regain unfettered corporate control over American society. His targeted audience was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Powell described the sources of the attack. Quote, they include, not unexpectedly, the communists, new leftists, and other revolutionaries who would destroy the entire system, both political and economic. These extremists of the left are far more numerous, better financed, and increasingly are more welcomed and encouraged by other elements of society than ever before in our history. But they remain a small minority, and they are not yet the principal cause for our concern. The most disquieting voices joining the chorus of criticism come from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals, the arts and scientists, and from politicians. In most of these groups, the movement against the system is participated in only by minorities. Yet these are often the most articulate, the most vocal, the most prolific in their writing and speaking. Powell called upon the Chamber to assemble a staff of scholars to evaluate social science textbooks, especially in economics, political science, and sociology. He emphasized that, quote, the Chamber should insist upon equal time on the college campus speaking circuit. The FBI, notice this, The FBI publishes each year a list of speeches made on college campuses by avowed communists. The number in 1970 exceeded 100. There were, of course, many hundreds of appearances by leftists and ultra-liberals who urged the types of viewpoints indicated earlier in the memorandum. There was no corresponding representative of American business, or indeed by individuals or organizations who appeared in support of the American system of government and free enterprise. Powell insisted that the national television network should be monitored in the same way that textbooks are. They should be kept under constant surveillance. This applies not merely to so-called educational programs, such as selling of the Pentagon, but to the daily news analysis with inverted quotes, which so often includes the most insidious type of criticism of the enterprise system. Whether this criticism results from hostility or economic ignorance, the result is the gradual erosion of confidence in business and free enterprise. This monitoring of ours, to be effective, would require constant examination of the text of adequate samples of programs. Complaints to the media and the Federal Communications Commission should be made promptly and strongly when programs are unfair or inaccurate. Powell's plan included dealing with radio and the press, which are also important, and every available means should be employed to challenge and refute unfair attacks, as well as to present the affirmative case through these media, as well as books, paperbacks, and pamphlets available on newsstands. Powell concluded his argument with a call for business to get directly involved in politics. Quote, there should not be the slightest hesitation to press vigorously in all political arenas for support for the enterprise system, nor should there be reluctance to penalize politically those who oppose it, end quote. This thoroughgoingly ruthless approach that Powell was advocating was being pursued all around the world at the same time. Earlier, the right-wing Libertarian Mont Pelerin Society had been created in 1947 at a conference organized by the godfather of right-wing economics, Friedrich Hayek. The purpose of the society was to be a scholarly community focused on combating collectivism. Over time, the society grew into an international think tank movement, including the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research in New York City, and the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Atlas, the name is after Atlas Shrugged by lunatic libertarian Ayn Rand. Having come together as the Atlas Network, they now support a number of right-wing think tanks, including Vancouver's own Fraser Institute, established in 1974. All of these think tanks have actively promoted neoliberalism, the 20th century version of the 19th century ideas associated with laissez-faire or economic liberalism. These include privatization, austerity, deregulation, free trade, and reductions in government spending, all designed to increase the power and influence of capital in the economy and society. The rise of these ideas and policies based on them, promoted by the right-wing think tanks and their corporate backers, led to a paradigm shift away from the Keynesian consensus which dominated in the post-World War II era. All of this was strongly reinforced by the election of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of England in 1979. It was she who coined the term TINA, there is no alternative, meaning that the market economy dominated by private wealth is the only one that works and that there's no room for debate on the matter. Earlier, I mentioned the surge of shop floor militancy that led to major wage increases in the 60s and 70s. At about the same time that Thatcher became Prime Minister of England, Paul Volcker became the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Volcker, who served under Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, responded to the high level of inflation that had been generated by labor militancy in the States by raising interest rates to unprecedented levels. This throttled the economy, leading to the collapse of a significant number of companies and a sharp rise in unemployment. Thus was solved, from a capitalist point of view, the problem of labor militancy and the attendant wage increases. In the same era, concerted effort by the U.S. to undermine the Soviet Union, combined with the system's internal problems, led to its collapse and that of the various communist regimes in Eastern Europe in 1991. This only served to reinforce the ideological view that Thatcher was right. The right-wing's triumphal arrogance at that time was typified by an essay written by political scientist and commentator Francis Fukuyama entitled The End of History, in which he argued that the advent of Western capitalist democracy signaled the end point of human evolution and the ultimate form of human government. Not everyone was as sanguine about all this as Fukuyama. Freed from the constraints of an existing alternative, capital went crazy. The predictable results included the advent of mass homelessness and pervasive housing crises, the dot-com bubble of 2001 and the financial crash of 2008, unparalleled levels of inequality with 6 richest men in the world currently possessing the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world population, and a systemic inability to mount the necessary response to the burgeoning climate change crisis because of the entrenched power of capital in the fossil fuel sector. In 1967, Martin Luther King presented a powerful indictment of all this in his April 4th speech delivered at the Riverside Church in New York City entitled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence. And I urge you to look this up on YouTube and listen to that speech. It's one of the greatest I've ever heard. King starts by criticizing the Vietnam War and the necessity of dissenting against it. He describes his own silence on the subject as a moral betrayal. He responds to the criticism that one shouldn't mix peace and civil rights. And then he listed several reasons for addressing the war in Vietnam, including the fact that hopes generated by the advent of the anti-poverty programs had been broken and eviscerated by the escalation of the war, which took the funds necessary to pay for the poverty programs. He then typified Vietnam as a war being the enemy of the poor. He noted that blacks were dying in numbers out of all proportion to their numbers of the U.S. population. King found that the preachments to young black men about nonviolence ringing hollow in the context of Vietnam and the U.S. use of violence in pursuit of its aims. He felt that he couldn't speak out against violence in the ghetto without addressing the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, the U.S. government. King went into the history of the conflict, noting that Vietnam had declared its independence in 1945 after the Japanese occupiers had been defeated, but the U.S. had opted to help France reestablish its colonial control of the country. This counter-revolutionary effort by the U.S. lasted 9 years. By the end of the war in 1954, when France was defeated at Dien Bien Phu, the U.S. was covering 80% of France's war costs. After that, it looked like peace would finally be allowed to break out there, but here again, the U.S. frustrated it by subverting the Geneva Accords that were signed in 1954, by virtue of which the country had been temporarily divided into a North and South, as Gary referred to earlier. And the U.S. Brought forth this guy, I think he had been a used car salesman in New Jersey or something, Diem, and they made him the head of the government there, backed him completely, allowed him to crush all opposition. Unfortunately for them, they were facing a communist-led insurgency led by Ho Chi Minh, who had earlier taken a fairly liberal approach with the United States, asking for its support in decolonizing the country, but the U.S. opted to side with the French to rebuild their colony there, and the rest is history. The U.S. lost in 1975, I guess it was. Time flies when you're having fun. And so despite all of the incredible machinations and resources that the U.S. deployed there, it failed absolutely. King understood that the war in Vietnam was symptom of a far deeper malady, though, that if not addressed would mean that future generations would be having the same conversation with respect to Guatemala, Peru, Thailand and Cambodia, Mozambique and a dozen other countries. He called for a significant and profound change in American policies. He pointed out that all of this came from refusing to give up the privileges that came with the immense profits of the U.S. overseas investments. King's was a stunning moral indictment. Quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military expense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Our only hope is to recapture the revolutionary spirit and declare our undying hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With such a commitment, we can challenge the status quo." King declared that we had to undergo this radical revolution of values and to begin the evolution of a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented one. In a society where profit, motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, racism, materialism, and militarism cannot be conquered. In my view, what he was promoting was a Christian vision that was completely compatible with the vision at the heart of Karl Marx's work. The task before us is to generate a politics compatible with both. Thanks.